think I've done anything to earn that applause yet, but I want to welcome everybody here tonight. We're really pleased to have you here for our first talk of the fall season. And I'm Mary Oppenheimer, the president of the Salisbury Forum. We have some great talks coming up. On Friday, November 9th, Dr. Joshua Ginsberg will be speaking on why I'm an environmental optimist. That will be at 7:30 right here at the Housatonic Valley Regional High School. And Dr. Ginsberg is the president of the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies. Chris Estes will be speaking on America's housing crisis on Friday, December 7th at the Hotchkiss School. On Sunday, January 27th, we'll be screening a documentary film at the Millerton Movie House, which will use personal stories to illustrate how the opioid epidemic is affecting the northwest corner of Connecticut. So I hope you'll save the dates and keep apprised of on our website and our emails to put them in your calendar and come join us. If we don't already have them, we'd appreciate it if you could give us your email and mailing addresses so that we can keep you better informed about events and speakers, as well as timely access to videos and general forum news. There have been people handing out cards for you to fill out. I know we have contact information for most of you, but if we don't, please give us that. I want to thank the Housatonic Valley Regional High School for hosting this talk. In November, we'll be beginning our fundraising appeal. We're most grateful for the support that we've gotten from the Hotchkiss School, the Salisbury School, some grants, and some local businesses. We depend on you, our audience, for 75% of our operating expenses. So we're extremely grateful for any donations you've given us in the past. Please consider a donation this year when you hear from us so we can continue to keep all of our talks free and available to everybody. We're very pleased to have Tom Nichols here tonight. You may have seen him in the news this past couple of weeks. He's an expert on national security and foreign affairs, a professor at the US Naval War College and at the Harvard Extension School. He's a Sovietologist and a fellow at the International History Institute of Boston University. He's the author of 6 books. Previously, he was a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He also happens to be a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. So that will resonate the most for everyone, I think. Please note he'll be signing copies of his book, The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge, and Why It Matters, out in the lobby. You might have passed them as you came in. And so after the lecture, be sure to take advantage of meeting him and getting an autographed copy. So with that, I hope you'll join me in giving a warm welcome to Tom Nichols.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for coming. I'll try to be relatively brief in the remarks so we can have more time for conversation. I am a trained professor and can talk at you all night, but I won't. So let me start. Oh, the first thing I have to start by telling you is that I do not in any way represent the views of the United States government, which will get more obvious as the evening goes on. So the first thing to say about this book is to ask a question, which is, why would I do this? Why would I write a book with such an obnoxious title that almost invites people to disagree with it right off the bat? Because we all know that expertise isn't dead. We all use expertise in our lives every day. I'm using it right now when we sit here in this auditorium and the lights go on and the water flows and the lawn gets mowed. We all, in some way, we're using expertise, whether it's plumbers or diplomats or mechanics or lawyers or whoever it is. So expertise isn't dead, but it is under siege, as is knowledge in general. And experts are under siege, and not just in the United States. We hear this quite often. The president himself said, the experts are terrible. What would it be like if I didn't have experts? Which we're figuring out in real time. During the Brexit campaign, one of the Brexiteers said, people are tired of these experts from agencies telling us what to do. There is a kind of global attack on experts and expertise that I think is new. Because the other question I think that always arises when you talk about something like this is, well, really, whoever likes intellectuals, really, and eggheads and professors? I mean, there's a story I tell in the book that I'm originally from Western Massachusetts, by the way. I'm from the Pioneer Valley, which is why I'm pronouncing my R's. And my brother ran a bar in Chicopee, and I was in there kind of hanging out with my brother and talking. I was a young professor, I was working up at Dartmouth. And I left, and one of the patrons turned to my brother and said, so, he's a professor. Your brother's a professor, huh? And my brother said, yeah. He said, huh, well, he seems like a good guy anyway. And that's not new. That's common. People have never been quite comfortable with eggheads or intellectuals or particularly narrow experts in a field. That's a normal thing. But there is something different, and I'll come back to it in a moment. But what's changed, I think, in the 21st century is not that people doubt experts, it's that people think they're smarter than experts. And that's what's really dangerous. Am I overreacting? Let me give you a couple of examples. What worries me is not that people don't know things. Again, that's normal. We don't walk around map testing each other all day. Life is not a 7th grade geography exam. But what worries me is that people, despite not knowing things, are less and less hesitant about expressing very strong views on things. Let me give you a few examples. In 2014, the Washington Post asked a cross-section of Americans what they thought we should do about the Russians invading Ukraine. And a fair number of Americans thought that we should put NATO troops and US troops into Ukraine to stop them. Or as we political scientists call it, World War III. Here's the rub. First of all, the average person in this survey did not know where Ukraine is. And if you'd like a little Jeopardy factoid, Ukraine is the largest country whose borders are entirely in Europe. So you could throw a dart at a map of Europe and probably hit it statistically. But the people who thought, and by the way, the average respondent in this survey, when asked to find Ukraine on a map, was off by an average of 1,800 miles. So we're talking about sometimes not even putting it on the right continent. The people that were most insistent on the use of force also were the people who were least likely to know where it was. So that when you said to them, this is where Ukraine is, it's right next to Russia, suddenly there were people saying, oh, maybe I should rethink that. But they don't stop to think about that at the outset. And this willingness to simply have an opinion and to be forceful about it, to be an advocate for an uninformed opinion, I think is something that is relatively new in our experience. Another example, I usually travel with a map that I've come to love. It's a map of the world from roughly the Persian Gulf out to the middle of the Pacific Ocean, down to Indonesia, Tanzania, places, sub-Saharan Africa, all the way up to Siberia and the middle of the Pacific. And it's covered in blue dots from one end to the other. I let people usually stare at that for a moment, and then I explain that each dot is the guess of an American adult about where North Korea is. Sri Lanka, Yemen, Russia, the middle of the Pacific Ocean. My favorite part of that map are the people who knew it was on the Korean Peninsula and identified it as being in the south, even though, north being right in the name, and they put it down in the southern half of the peninsula. That does not stop people from having very strong opinions about what we might do with a country with whom we could potentially be, and sooner than we might like to be, in a nuclear conflict. Only about 1/3 of the people that were polled, including college graduates, could correctly locate North Korea on a map. But that doesn't stop people from having firm opinions, strong opinions about what we should do about North Korea. Finally, there was the case some years ago or a somewhat mischievous polling firm decided, a left-leaning polling firm, decided to prove that Republicans are warlike. And they got the result. They got the result they expected. They asked Republicans whether or not we should bomb Agrabah. And there were a fair number of Republicans who said, yes, absolutely, that's what it takes, you got to get in there and bomb. The unexpected finding was the large number of Democrats who had a very strong opinion about, no, absolutely not, cannot bomb Agrabah. Right? Some of you clearly have children or grandchildren, because what you're realizing is that about half the people asked had a very firm opinion about whether to bomb the fictional country in the cartoon Aladdin. Agrabah doesn't exist. And yet, ask Americans, how do you feel about bombing Agrabah? Well, I have some thoughts about that. Instead of saying, wait, isn't that a cartoon? I imagine there's a fair number of people here who may remember the old series Cheers, and Cliff, the mailman, who was always coming up with know-it-all off the top of his head. You know, it's a well-known fact, Dan. And the problem is we're all Cliff now. We've all turned into that guy. And that, I think, is what's different about this. I think, you know, even though it's kind of humorous to point out how little people know about maps and how we're all turning into Cliff the mailman, this is a really dangerous thing. And it's dangerous not just in terms of our democracy, which I'll talk about in a moment. It's dangerous on an individual level. And I'll give you an example. I was giving a talk much like this one, and afterwards I was in the Midwest, and a pediatric surgeon came up to me and he said that he, as most doctors were a big constituency for this book, because you know, every doctor, I talked to a lot of doctors and they said, oh, thank God, somebody, you know, we're tired of people coming in and explaining to us what we're going to do. And in this particular case, a couple brought in a very young child, a toddler, and said, here's the procedure we've selected you to do. And the doctor said, I don't recommend that procedure at all. It's very dangerous. I don't think it's indicated for this child. I think, you know, I think this is a mistake. I think they were very huffy. They said, we've done our research. We know what we're talking about here, and this is what we want you to do. And of course, he declined. They went to a different doctor, and the child was gravely injured. This is happening. I've talked with lawyers who have clients in jail because they were smarter than their lawyers. It's a phenomenon that is out of control. So the one question to ask at this point is, how did we get here? How did this happen? And I would argue that most people instantly will say, it's the internet, right? Because we love to blame the internet. Well, Clavin predates the internet. And I think this predates the internet. I would say the underlying problem we're dealing with here is an epidemic of narcissism that's been around probably for at least 40 years. If you think about it, the rejection of knowledge, the rejection of expertise, the rejection of expert advice is a deeply narcissistic exercise. Now, in some cases, it's also an attempt, I think, for people to empower themselves because they feel helpless. You know, it's a scary world. You know, and I'm a father. I didn't like the first time somebody stuck a needle into my kid and made her cry because she needed a vaccine. You know, my paternal instinct immediately was to say, don't do that. It feels like powerlessness to simply have someone say to you, look, this is my field. I know what I'm doing. I know it's unpleasant. But I really do think that there is a tremendous amount of narcissism that has taken root in the developed world. And the reason I say the developed world is one of the things that surprised me. I originally wrote this as a blog post. I don't blog anymore because I think blogs are part of the problem. And then it was picked up as an article, and I didn't even think of it. Somebody said, can we run this piece? And I said, sure. And a magazine ran it. And I thought no more about it. And then I started getting mail from all over the world as this thing went viral. And actually the book, if you choose to go home with a book, the book wasn't was really Oxford's idea initially, that the editors at Oxford came and said, you know, this really is a thing. This could be something you might want to write about. And I was surprised because some of it, to me, I kind of took seriously the argument, you know, that maybe I'm just getting old, I'm a curmudgeon, that, you know, some of this was just me yelling at everybody to get off my lawn. But at this point, the book's, as of about a year out, the book's being translated into 11 languages, which surprised me. And in places that you wouldn't have expected it, you know, in places where I would have thought there was more respect for teaching and expertise and knowledge, places like Japan and Korea and China and places like that. So I think we're witnessing a global phenomenon here in the developed world. There are a lot of things. I don't really do a social history of narcissism. Other people have written about that. Christopher Lasch and others have written good books on this, so that's not really my thing. But I tried to identify 3 more recent trends and areas where I think this death of expertise has taken root. And one is education. Now, I teach undergraduates as well as graduate students. I don't teach K through 12, but I talked with a fair number of K through 12 teachers. And I think one of the things that came out of this for me is how we do education in the modern world, which is to say that we have moved since the 60s or the 70s into a very therapeutic model of education. We don't ask students what they're learning, we ask them how they feel. We don't ask them what they know, we ask them if they're happy. We don't ask them what they learned in a course, we ask them if they enjoyed it. And you know, some of that is, again, I know it's sort of the old guy griping about trophy, everybody gets a trophy. It's something deeper than that. And it's not sour grapes on my part. I think I should be upfront about this and with no false modesty say that in a 30-year teaching career, I've been pretty good at it. I've won teaching awards. I mean, I'm not standing here and saying, you know, those damn kids never appreciated me. I've never really had a problem in the classroom. And yet, both as a teacher, as a professor, as a department head, as a department chairman, I've gone through the exercise, for example, of reading hundreds upon hundreds of student evaluations. And I have some real concerns about a system in which we ask teenagers to evaluate middle-aged professionals on whether or not they know what they're talking about. That's something that began after the 60s as I may no longer be a Republican, but I'm still something of a conservative. I like to blame all bad things on the 60s. And I understood that I actually think student evaluations are a very useful tool. For me as an administrator, I thought they were important. They gave me good markers and guidelines for how to do things. Excuse me. But there is still something inherently odd about that exercise. To ask students to review faculty as though they're at a restaurant. You know, the religion course was spicy, but the political science course needed a dash of, you know, insouciance. There's something wrong with that. And I think part of the problem here is that we have so accepted the notion that college education should be universal that we now treat it almost like high school. And this creates the illusion of learning because the students walk in already believing they are the peers of the faculty. And it makes them resistant to further learning. I think a big part of undergraduate and especially graduate education is breaking down the notion that students inevitably have that they already know enough about this subject. And I was one of them. You know, when I worked my way through college and my first year or two of grad school, and then I got a fellowship to finish my doctorate. And when I got that fellowship, I thought, well, who's possibly smarter than I am? I got a fellowship. And of course, I spent my first year in graduate school with this fellowship explaining subject matter back to the professors because I was very smart. And one of them, I never forgot the life lesson one of them taught me. He became a lifelong friend. He's a Jesuit professor at Georgetown. And we just had these endless kind of go-arounds because I didn't agree with his interpretation of Plato. Imagine that. And at the end of the course, I got an A, which I took to be affirmation. Now, this is a professor, I should add, who did something that no professor would dare do today. He used to begin his classes by handing out an essay called What a Student Owes a Teacher. Docility, humility, trust. And he would hand this out at the beginning of every term. You would have a revolt on your hands if you did that today. We got through the course. I got my A, which I thought was an affirmation of how wonderfully intelligent I was. And I walked up to him at the Christmas party, and I said, "Merry Christmas, Father. What do you say? Peace on earth, goodwill towards men?" And he looked at me. He was a big, tall man, gray hair. He looked at me over his glasses. He said, "What I say to you, Mr. Nichols, is repent." It was at that moment I thought, perhaps I have more to learn. So I think education kind of fuels this, the idea that, because college is no longer a particularly exclusive experience, to say, well, I went to college, or I have a college education, in talking with someone who's an expert, it becomes an almost default answer. And I don't know how to solve this last problem, but there's also the problem of grade inflation. And I live with it every day, just like all my colleagues at universities all over the world do. I taught briefly at Dartmouth, and like the rest of the Ivy League schools, they have problems where median grades are in the A to A- range. Well, I don't care how Lake Wobegon we decide to get, all the children are not that above average. This is now creating an illusion of knowledge among a generation of Americans who believe that they have not just gone to college, but they've gone to a university, because of course every college has rebranded itself as a university now. And so that's part of the problem, is that education is actually hardening these bad habits of thought rather than breaking them down. There's also the problem of the media. And I don't just mean Fox News, I mean all of it. I think in this audience, some of us are old enough to remember, and my students are always goggle-eyed when I tell them this, that the evening news used to be 15 minutes long. That before the Vietnam War really picked up its pace and intensity, the evening news was 15 minutes, and nobody could turn a dime off it. It was a total non-profit loser institution, which made it great. Still, even when it went to a half an hour, I think there is something to be said for the people who've been critical to look back in the past and say, yeah, it was great, but it was, 3 old white guys reading corporate curated news feeds from New York City. And so I think we live in a better information space now. We live in a better information environment now, where we have more diverse voices, more choice in media and information and news, and yet it's actually hurting us. And I think the best analogy I can offer is that in a similar way, Americans of the 21st century have never had more access to food than at any time in history, which probably explains why we're all overweight and diabetic. Because we don't make good choices about this. We just take in a lot of calories indiscriminately. And we're getting heavier and less healthy when in fact this should be a golden age of food, because we have every, I guess I'm still old enough to be amazed to walk into a supermarket in the dead of winter and get grapes and peaches, because I can. And I think what's happened with the media is that the media became a for-profit institution, and it became segmented. There was so much bandwidth available that it had to be filled with something. And what media moguls in every network, not just Roger Ailes. I mean, Ailes was better at it than most people, but what every media outlet figured out is, in fighting for those eyeballs and fighting for that slice of your attention, the answer was not to tell you interesting stuff that you needed to know. It was to tell you stuff you wanted to hear. And we'll get to the internet in a moment, but it's kind of like, how does Facebook decide what to talk to you about? It tells you about, it figures out what you liked already. The media works the same way. I was on a panel about a year ago with Dan Baltz of the Washington Post, and we were making this point, and Baltz is one of the senior editors at the Post, and someone stood up and said, well, why don't you journalists help us? Why don't you publish more explainers and think pieces and explanatory and analytical? And he said, we do. You don't read them. And then he said, you won't read them. That's on us. And I think a theme in the book and a theme in what I want to talk to you about tonight is, in the end, we can look for people to blame, but all the people to blame are all sitting, here and in living rooms around America. This is on us. Newspapers are dying because people won't read them. We want to get things delivered to us in an entertaining, quick fashion. It's changed even our vocabulary. When you ask someone, did you watch the news tonight? And they say, yeah, I watched the news. What they mean is, I walked through a room where the news was on like video wallpaper, right? Because it's just on. If you said to my parents' generation, did you watch the news? To steal a line from the book Primary Colors, my father was so interested in news, he practiced aerobic listening. You know, that when the news went on, you couldn't talk to my father because it was almost like he was expending calories trying to listen to the news. So if you said to someone, did you watch the news? And they said, yes, you knew they'd spend a half an hour or an hour concentrating really hard on something. Now if you ask people, did you watch the news? They say, yeah, Anderson Cooper was on while I was working out and I think I saw something about something. Again, it's almost too easy. And it's segmented according to interest. Yes, there's Fox News for conservatives. There's MSNBC for liberals. CNN has decided to kind of be the one on go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump most of the time. All of them are excellent, and even Fox has you're not going to believe this, but they do have an excellent hard news division that gets drowned out by what goes on in the complete crazy pants primetime stuff. But what they're doing is they're giving people stuff they already want to listen to. And you can spend an entire day taking in information in any direction you want, and never encounter something you don't like, or hear something that you don't agree with. When my students ask me how they should take in media, I say, go out of your way. Well, first I say to make sure to examine the provenance of things. I always tell students, don't trust any media that doesn't have an editor. That's why I shut down my blog, because I was the editor, which is to say there was no editing at all. Students would say, can we quote your blog? And I'd say, the editor of that thing's an idiot. And they'd kind of look at me for a second and say, but and I'd say, right. People, no writer, and if any of you, especially students in the audience, if you're aspiring to be writers, never work without an editor. Editors are your friends. They're not the enemy. It's very trendy, it's always been trendy for writers to say, oh, editors, I hate them. No, editors are the people who make you into better writers. So I always tell students, make sure there's something edited. Does it have to go through a process? Does it have to be approved, vetted somehow? I mean, that's part of the problem with primetime television in general, is that the editors, things get loosey-goosey when you're trying to run stuff that people want to see. But the other thing that I always tell people is go find some source of news or a magazine or a news magazine or a magazine of commentary that you don't like, that you don't agree with, and read it once or twice a month. Just challenge yourself to read it. When I worked in the US Senate as an aide to the late John Hines. So he was a Republican, although in a time when Republican meant something very different. And I made it a point as a Republican staffer, I had a subscription I subscribed to all the stuff, and I also read the conservative press, I had a subscription to National Review and things like that. I also made sure to have a subscription to The Nation and Mother Jones as a Republican staffer. Because, look, I knew what the Republicans thought. I could go to lunch with those guys every day and get that. I wanted to know what people on the left thought. And I think that's a really important exercise, is to challenge yourself and to get outside of your partisanship or to get outside of your preferred information stream and to try something different. As long as, again, it's within, I don't suggest that you go to, Breitbart or, crazy, vaccineplot.org or anything like that. But, there are reputable forms of the media across the spectrum. And I think if you're not at least sampling what people who don't agree with you think, then you're not a fully informed consumer of the media. Finally, the internet. Now I should say, and there's an old friend of mine in the audience, so I have proof positive. I love technology. I was an early adopter of the internet. I'm a geek. I'm almost 58 years old. I still play games now and then. I mean, I'm second to no one in my love of computing and the internet. But I'm terrified at what I thought was once a very positive force for social good, turning into something that is basically rotting our brains here. And there's a couple of reasons that's happening. One is that I think younger people in particular do not understand that the internet is not a curated space. They think that things that exist on the internet are there because they're just true, or because they're just, like it's a lot of young, I've had students very often say, well, the internet, why do we need, you don't, I mean, I know why we need to listen to old teachers like you and all that stuff, but the internet's a library. No, the internet is not a library. The internet is a dumpster. And sometimes you will, on rare occasions, you will find some very good stuff in there. Mostly what you will find is junk. There are 1 billion websites in the world. And if only 10% of them are good, that's great. That's 100 million websites. That means there's 900 million places that are run by cranks and corporations that don't have your interest at heart, just want to sell you something, or ISIS, or other terrorist organizations. I think, we have just come to accept the internet as this like public utility that provides knowledge, and that's not what it does. The internet is not a neutral arbiter of information. It has no filters. It has whatever people put there. And that's the other thing, is that we're starting to get more and more information through algorithms that we ourselves don't understand. And we're not conscious of it, and we're not thinking about it. I think another problem with the internet is that it appeals to our vanity, to our narcissism, and to our fundamental laziness. The fact that in the 21st century, there is actually an acronym, TLDR. Too long, didn't read. You send that to a friend, right? And they send you back a note, TLDR, too long. The internet is part of one of the many influences, like the modern college, that creates the illusion of knowledge through shortcuts. Just like when people say, oh yeah, I read the news, or I saw the news today. And I said, did you read that? Where do you get your, oh yeah, I read that. No, well, we know this from research. I feel like now I'm turning to Cliff. As some studies have shown us. But studies have shown us that, for example, people think they're reading when they're scanning. And mostly what they're scanning is either the title or the first sentence. Younger people, in particular, children, tend to believe the first 10 search results are true and authoritative, meaning if you ask it the right way, that yes, Barack Obama was born in Africa, because you can get that answer anytime you want out of the magic answer box. We've also found that people cannot distinguish between what they thought they already knew and what passed in front of their eyeballs while they were surfing. And the way to think about this is, imagine a young person doing a report on fossil fuels. And she starts clicking, and fossil fuels are made out of dead dinosaurs. Okay, so you click back, dinosaurs, and then Jurassic period. At the end of it, what we found is that people will believe that they already knew stuff about dinosaurs, when in fact, they just passed it on their way to doing something else, and they mistake it for native knowledge. That's really dangerous, because what it means is, as you click through pages, many of which are just vicious lies, let's face it, you start believing that you already knew this. So I didn't learn that on the internet. I always knew that, that Hillary Clinton was one of the lizard people here for our water. I just knew that. And that is incredibly dangerous. And it provides students with this, and I think with, the big problem is barbell shaped. Students and older people who just want to get to an answer. The group in the middle are in some ways worse because they just don't read the stuff. The people who spend a lot of time on the internet are old people and young people. So that's among the many influences that I think got us here. Let me say a couple of words about who experts are and what happens when they go wrong. And then I'll say a couple of words about democracy, and then we can get to the Q&A. I've been throwing around this word expert, and people often come back to me and they say, well, when you say expert, you mean somebody with a PhD like you. And I don't mean that. I mean anyone who has substantive, authoritative knowledge in a field of study. And that can be a master plumber. Lynn and I had a house fire recently, and our house was full of experts. Electricians, contractors, carpenters, painters. My doctorate in international relations was worth zip. Mostly my job was to get out of the way. All these guys knew what they were doing. They were absolute experts in their field. And yet they will even tell you stories. People walk around and say, kind of wire are you putting in there? Like, you'd know, right, if he answered you. Oh, I'm putting in kryptonite wire. Oh, okay, good. So, you know, there's credentials, there's experience, there's training, there's peer affirmation, there's a lot of ways to become an expert. But the thing that people bristle at, it's necessarily exclusive. If you're an expert at one thing, you're probably not an expert at most other things. And this is, again, something that's new, where people simply say, you know, I'm a software engineer, so let me tell you about Russia. We've developed this notion that we're omnicompetent about everything, and that we have to have an opinion about everything, and I think that's very dangerous, because it's simply not possible. Now, one quick word here about experts being wrong, which I should say never happens. Actually, in the book, I talk about the worst call I ever made professionally. I've made mistakes. I've written things that are wrong. I've had to eat my words on occasion. Experts get things wrong. We are human beings just like you. And we suffer from the same failure of trust that other institutions suffer from, particularly since the 1970s, after Watergate, after Vietnam, after you know, repeated kind of blows to our body politic. Yes, you know, I always tease my own doctor. So eggs are okay again, right? Yeah, you can eat all the eggs you want, you know. You know, but that doesn't mean your doctor doesn't know more than you about staying alive. Experts can be wrong. They engage in fraud, in falsification, in misrepresentation, in, you know, hooliganism and mookery and all the human sins. And we do all the bad things that human beings do. Nonetheless, that does not, and this is where, again, I think this is something new, where people think that evidence of expert misconduct therefore invalidates all expertise, almost as a way of getting out from under having to listen to our advice. Well, you doctors were wrong about eggs, so that's why I'm having a cheeseburger and a beer for breakfast. It doesn't work that way. Nonetheless, I do think experts have some significant flaws. I think we tend to lack empathy, which I don't really care about. We tend to lack empathy because we live in our own heads. We know our field so well. It always reminds me of a math teacher I had in high school who just didn't understand people that didn't get trigonometry right out of the birth canal. Like anybody that didn't understand trig was just like a lower life form. And experts that happens to us. We're the people that will stupidly, you know, if someone's out of work, we'll say, well, you know, the unemployment rate's really low. Well, okay, but to that guy, it's 100%. And it doesn't help for us to say that. So we do make those mistakes. We're also unwilling to own up to them sometimes because we don't want to hurt the entire field that we're in by screwing something up. So we tend to not be as transparent as we could be about our mistakes. Maybe we'd talk about this more in the Q&A, but I also think that a lot of things that are expert mistakes are not mistakes. They are things that the public asked us to do for them that turned out not so good. You know, the story I always tell are the people since 2010 who call their congressmen who rely on experts and say, I want you to repeal Obamacare, but I want you to keep the Affordable Care Act. Not much an expert can do with that. And that leads me to my last point, and then I'd be glad to take your questions and have a discussion with you. I am really worried because I don't think we can sustain a democracy on this. We cannot sustain a republic that requires delegated powers to people who must make many decisions on our behalf about running an incredibly complicated society and who must rely on expert advice. We can't sustain that republic in this kind of willful, aggressive ignorance. We are not a direct democracy. We're not just, you know, our elected officials and their advisors are not just megaphones for whatever the people back home said. If that were the case, we would just, you know, meet in the public square once a year and do the budget. That's not how a republic works. And we are engaging in behavior that is, with small r republic, that is anti-republican in the way the founders conceived this country. And I think that's happening in other democracies as well. And they're starting to become afraid in places like Italy, for example, that this project is starting to come apart because you cannot sustain a advanced democracy on intentional, willful, resentful ignorance. I don't quite know what to do about that, so let me just end on a depressing note. I worry that this will finally right itself in the wake of a disaster. The anti-vaccine movement will end, but it might take a pandemic first. That'll put a stop to that in a hurry. An economic depression and potentially even a military conflict really worry me. Remember that experts came to the fore after 1945 to rebuild a world shattered by war. I'd kind of like us to skip that step this time. Let me stop there and take your questions.
Questions? No speechifying, please.
Hi. First of all, I agree with everything you say, and I also...
Good meeting.
Good, right, you're an expert. And there's so many things, so I'm going to just have to pick on one, but I'd love you to talk about the Soviet and the Russians, too, at some point. I'm of that generation that ruined the world in the 60s, and part of the reason was arrogance by the experts. If I had a teacher like you, I wasn't a pain in the you-know-what. But the arrogance of doctors and professionals is what got me going. So it felt a little simplistic, so I'll let you talk, but please talk about the Russians too.
I am a Russophile. I studied Russia because I think they're fascinating people. I think they're people capable of greatness. I have some very close members of my family who are Russians, including my daughter. I share their religion. I'm Eastern Orthodox. But I consider their government a dedicated enemy of everything I stand for and that my government stands for or should stand for. And so I think we're in a very dangerous phase. I think the Russian people have been cursed by their own governments for years, and this is no exception. Arrogance. Let me tell you about arrogance, okay? It's kind of funny because on Twitter, I'm considered probably one of the most arrogant human beings who ever lived because I can be. I understand that, again, that's what I mean about, I think there's a lack of empathy that, you come in and you say, doctor, I'm really scared, right? I've got this thing and it's and the doctor goes, yeah, whatever, look, here, two of these, get out. Because to him, and I say him in those days, right? Because it was always a guy. It's old. Two of you're out. Get out of here. You're fine. He may be right, but it doesn't help you because you're scared. And yeah, it is off-putting. And I think that experts have to own some of that to say that we should be. I think, for example, in my own field of public affairs, diplomacy, foreign policy. More of us ought to be out here doing this. I'm all about telling public intellectuals to become public intellectuals, to get out of their offices and go talk to people and to argue with them and tell them, as far as I'm concerned, society is the client of every professional. And our job is to speak truth to power. And that means speaking truth to power even when it's you in a large group. Now, sometimes that comes across as arrogant because at some point, I'll tell you what spurred, and you'll see if you think this was arrogant, but what spurred this whole book was a young person arguing with me about Edward Snowden. About 5 years ago, I said, look, Russia's fingerprints are all over this thing. Now, you are all looking at me now going, duh, but 5 years ago, that was a controversial opinion. I'm always pleased to see my controversial opinions become the conventional wisdom. And finally, this young person who had no background in any of this said, Tom, I don't think you really understand Russia. Let me explain Russia to you. And that's when I said, no. No, this is where I talk and you listen. Now, that is not a teaching mode that people appreciate sometimes. I don't know if anybody saw a couple of weeks ago, I was on CBS Sunday Morning talking about flat earthers. And I think, first of all, I don't believe flat earthers believe it. I think they're attention-seeking nincompoops by and large. But I also think we have been trained to deal with this in that therapy, right? You believe the world is flat? Let's unpack that. Let's explore. Well, that's what experts were taught to do so they wouldn't be perceived as arrogant. And my answer to that is to say, let's start by saying you're wrong. I say in the book, there's a couple of phrases I really hate. One of them is, let's agree to disagree. I hate that phrase. Man, do I hate that phrase. When someone says, well, let's just agree to disagree, I said, no, let's start by just agreeing that you're wrong. Arrogant? Okay, I'll cop to it. But at some point, we are not peers in the discussion. You know, and I've been on the other side of that. I very confidently, I was with a group of people in DC some years ago with some friends, and I very confidently had an opinion about what was going on in healthcare. Healthcare. And finally, one of my colleagues said, Tom, I worked on this in Congress for 6 years. You're wrong. And I said, good time for me to practice my being quiet skills. That, I was wrong, and I was kind of holding forth, I have many opinions, and they're very important. I was doing exactly the thing that I think people shouldn't do, and I got called up short on it. Was that guy arrogant? No. He was saying, you're just wrong. So I think more of that and less coddling would probably be better. I think we'd all be better off being a little more stoic about arguments.
Why did you leave the Republican Party?
I was told there'd be no math. Well, let me say again that I don't represent the views of the United States government or the Navy. I'm here on my own time. I wrote at length about why I left the Republican Party in the Atlantic about a week ago. So I don't want to dodge it and say, well, I'll do the reading, but the short version is that I gave up hope that there is a moderate centrist bloc within the Republican Party that will rescue it after this implosion of this Trumpist nightmare that it's going through. I hung in there, as did a pretty varied group of people. Bill Kristol is still a Republican. Michael Steele, I just was, if you want to hear more about this, I did a podcast with Michael Steele the other day, as former chairman of the RNC. They believe that, I think, at least in some sense, their approach was, we're not just going to hand the keys to the house to a bunch of squatters who are going to burn the place down. The party of Lincoln took 150, 160 years to be formed. You don't just hand over the deed to the house and say, well, here's some, gasoline and matches, have a good time. But I also don't know what else to do about it. And I kind of gave up on them. I would rather be an undecided voter for whom both parties now compete to get my vote, rather than institutionally affiliated with one party. And I actually wrote a whole piece in the Washington Post shortly before I left, which could tell you that I was already getting into this thought process, where I said the only way to save the current GOP and to restore any sanity to it is for people to vote straight Democratic, I think, next time around, in 2018. Because they have to lose. They have to feel the pain of adopting these crazy positions. Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not joining. Nobody's getting a commission on me joining the Democrats, because their ability to screw up an election is almost infallible. So we'll see what happens. But I just left because I just didn't think there was a center there anymore, and I just don't think that it's recoverable in my lifetime. And so and I'll admit to one other thing, and this is where people who were mad at me about this and making, kind of peacocking my way out, saying, well, I'm leaving, as if I'm like anybody. Yeah, there was an issue of vanity involved, that at some point, there's only so many of these rallies I can watch before I say I cannot be institutionally associated with people that are chanting these things. I just cannot. So I did it for me, partly.
So in your piece in The Atlantic, you mentioned Rand Paul, and I was wondering if you still saw him as part of that centrist bloc that you hoped for. You mentioned how you were shocked that the party was able to sort of appall even him.
I never thought of Rand Paul as a Republican, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Or you're talking about, not Rand, I'm talking about Ron Paul. I mean, I have no truck with libertarians. I find them to be morally rudderless. They are not, they are just not my idea of a party, and every 4 years they prove why. So, I think politics has to have some kind of a value judgment orientation in it. I mean, I don't agree with Democrats about everything, but they have values that they espouse. Republicans used to have values they espouse. And as I said in the Atlantic piece, ironically, it's now the Republicans who are the party of moral relativism, the party of whatever works. Free trade? I'm for that. Oh, wait, tariffs? Okay, I'm for that too. All in the service of just winning and being in power. The Paul family I've never looked at them as indicators of anything except a kind of libertarian fringe that kind of catches a ride on the Republican Party now and then. But it was an interesting moment, and the first time I really was estranged from the Republican Party, first time I dropped my registration for a few years, where I just didn't want to think about it anymore, was the 2012 primary. When Ron Paul, one of the most extreme libertarians there is, right, says, well, if somebody doesn't have insurance, I'm a doctor, and they come in, what do you want me to do? Let them die? And the audience starts yelling, yes, let them die. Give us Barabbas, it's like, whoa, Ron Paul himself going, wow, what have we unleashed here? And I said, we've created a monster. We've created a monster with this. And then Newt Gingrich won the South Carolina primary, and I said, I cannot deal with a party that takes Newt Gingrich seriously as a presidential contender. So that was my first kind of, red flag that maybe this was not the party for me.
I was just thinking, based on more on what the first commenter said, I think it's perhaps a generational thing, because my mother is all about doctors as deities and totally against the doctors, and she hates how they tell her what needs to be done. I, on the other hand, am totally not like that. And I think she also is a child of the 60s. I think it was just that generation.
I think that's true. And, I grew up in the 60s, and, maybe we paid too much deference to experts. And it was an easy time to do that, right? Because pretty hard to argue and say, I don't know how you feel about these experts when a guy is waving at you from the moon. By 1971, we're driving dune buggies on the moon. I still remember, golfers here, Alan Bean, I think it was a 7-iron. We got so bored with going to the moon that one of our guys hit a golf ball off the lunar surface because he could. Because it would be a gas. It's hard to look at that and say, these eggheads, they don't know what they're talking about. No, there's a guy golfing on the moon, I think they know what they're doing. The problem is that I think, we then said, well, those people know anything, then they must know everything. And, my parents were that same generation. You don't argue with the doctor, right? Doctors were gods. If the doctor said, take this horse pill, and don't worry about what's in it. You said, yes, sir, and you took the horse pill, and you didn't worry about it. I think we have gone too far in the other direction. What I think most doctors would tell you is to say, look, I want an informed patient who asks me questions. Fine, ask me questions. I'll answer them. And if you don't like my answers, go to another expert, right? Go to another doctor and check my work. If you don't think, that you should saw your leg off, go to another surgeon and ask him what you should do. We've now gone to people walking, we've gone from doctors are gods to people walking in literally, and I can't tell you how many times doctors told me this story. Doc, here's what I have. So, and by the way, so hang on, I'm not done, Doc. And here's what you're going to prescribe me. And I think it probably should be about 6 to 8 weeks. And the doctor's sitting there saying, one surgeon said to me, he had gotten to the point where he just wants to put all the medications and tools on a tray and put it down and say, you do it.
Isn't one of the issues with trust the expert the question of what the expert's motivation might be? In the case of doctors, and I'm actually married to a doctor, there is the question of whether the doctor is trying to give you the advice which is really best for you, or give you the advice which is going to maximize his profit.
If you don't believe that doctors have your best interest in heart, then society falls apart. Because then lawyers don't have your best interest at heart, engineers don't have your best interest at heart, no professionals have your best interest at heart. There are always going to be bad professionals. There's always going to be the lawyer who tells you not to have an amicable divorce because he'll make a lot more money off of it, right? To say, you say, look, I just want to have an amicable divorce, and the lawyer says, no, let's go nuts, because he'll line his pockets. That's a bad lawyer. There will be doctors who will treat you, without empathy, or who will say, let's do a lot of expensive procedures because it's good for me. There are bad doctors. That does not mean that the medical profession as an institution has collapsed. And I think if your going in assumption is that doctors are just out to line their pockets, then you probably shouldn't just go to a doctor, just do it yourself. Because that means you don't trust you don't trust professionalism. And when we don't trust the division of labor, and when we don't trust in the basic ramifications of professionalism, then there is no point in consulting experts or professionals, because your going in assumption is they're just trying to line their pockets. Well, doctors who kill people, eventually, some of them get away with it, some of them are called up by medical boards. Lawyers get disbarred, teachers get fired, engineers get, yes, they do. Don't shake your head at me, yes, they do. It happens all the time. There's no engineer who says, well, I'm going to design this elevator, and if it falls, I won't be in it. I just don't know it. I don't know people like that. They exist, but I don't think they're representative of their professions.
Another question.
I have a question here. Your notion of an apocalypse that may happen in order to right the situation currently is like the black swan theory that some people use. Could the results of the midterms and the 2020 election be such that it has the potential for our country to right itself?
Did everybody hear the question? No. You're not going to cure this kind of willful ignorance and resentment and anger overnight with one election. It's not going to happen. And, look, don't fall into the trap of thinking that it's just the crazy right-wingers who don't believe in facts and evidence and science and all that stuff. Talk to anybody who's been working the anti-vaccine beat or the GMO beat to find out how people on the left react to science they don't like either. It happens. Now, I think a lot of the more hot-button issues today tend to be things that kind of bring people on the right out into the public square. And I definitely think, when they have a political leader who's out there saying, no one tells you the truth but me, everything's fake news, it's definitely a problem. But I don't think that the Democrats winning a midterm election is going to solve this, because this is now hardened tribalism. And even if if the Democrats win, they're going to think they won, probably for the wrong reasons. If the Republicans win, if the Republicans lose, even more importantly, they're not going to start saying, oh, maybe facts are real. They are. I think that we have gotten to a point where there's a certain number of partisans on both sides, but I would say heavily concentrated in older Republicans, who are never going to change their minds. Period. About anything. That's just a done deal now. That's baked into the cake. So I think, you might adopt policies that I would like to see divided government because, I happen to love the Constitution. And I think divided government will restrain some of the worst impulses of this executive branch. And it will force the Democrats, I think if the Democrats go from being a majority to being in power, they're going to have to start governing instead of complaining. I mean, governing makes you do stuff instead of just being in the opposition. I think it'd be good for everybody to have divided government at this point. But I don't think that's going to solve any of these problems overnight. I want, my heart's with you and saying, we can fix it, we can right the ship. It's going to take a lot longer than one election. It really is. And it's going to have to be a change in civic culture, not in our institutions. The institutions are only as good as we are. And if we're stubborn and resentful and ignorant, then our institutions will be stubborn and resentful and ignorant. And you can't change that with an election.
Mr. Nichols, how do you fit your thesis of the too many people with bad but strong opinions with abysmally low voter turnout? People don't choose that forum to express opinions.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's because we are affluent and spoiled and lazy. We love to, we sit back in the Barca-Lounger and we put our feet up and say, let me tell you about healthcare. Let me explain North Korea to you. And then say, well, maybe you ought to go vote about this. It's on a Tuesday, there's a game on, I was busy, there was a plague of locusts, I fell in a ditch, blah, blah, blah. People are basically, I think one of the things that has caused this problem in our society is affluence. And that seems strange to say when people are, at a time, say, well, there's a lot of people hurting. Any of us old enough to remember the 60s or the late 1970s? My students don't even know what the word stagflation means. And I bet there's people in this audience don't even know what it means when the economy was so bad. I think that we have gotten used to such a high level of technology and of things just working that we just take it for granted. And we say, well, I'm mad about things, but there's a game on, and I have a lot of channels to watch. I think the other thing I would say, going back to your question about the election, is, this problem of civic virtue. When you hear people say, this is an existential election, this is an incredible threat, this is the worst threat ever, well, the projection models are, young people are still probably not going to break 25 or 30% turnout. There was this morning, for those of you that saw me, I was on Morning Joe this morning, and Tom Perez was asked, the Democratic National Chairman was asked, a recent poll showed that only 49% of Hispanics are actually very engaged in thinking about voting in this election. Tom Perez, said, well, no, they're going to get out and vote. And, it was like, you could almost hear the prayer, involved. I think that we are children, we are spoiled, narcissistic children of affluence who love to bitch and complain, but we don't actually get out there and vote. In the most tempestuous election of my lifetime, which was this last one, 2016, only 6 out of 10 people voted. It's just inexcusable, and it's on us.
This multi-layered assault on knowledge that you've been talking about for so many different reasons, with education, with the internet, with blogs, with fake news, and so on, do you see any measures, any things that people can begin to do to try to turn the tide?
The most important thing we can start to do to turn the tide is start being nicer to each other. I'm not kidding. I think we need to start approaching things from a position of charity and trust, rather than to say, every person I read, every journalist I read is a charlatan, every expert I consult is a huckster, every person I talk to is my enemy. I think if we just started from the assumption that we mean each other well, we'd get a lot further with this. And we're going to make mistakes. We're going to get mad at each other. It's like being married. You're going to have, although I've never had a fight with my wife, actually. So far. But it's like being married. You're going to have fights now and then. But I think we've gone into this with such bad faith about everything. We turn on the news and say, well, it's good. I'll give you one example, then get the next question. Someone asked me, well, what do you read? And I said, well, I usually start with the Washington Post. I was a Capitol Hill guy. I lived in Washington for years. I went to Georgetown, all that stuff. I read the Post. He said, well, I'm not going to read that. That's inside the Beltway. That's the inside the Beltway power brokers. I said, okay, well, there's America's newspaper of record, the Gray Lady. You could read the New York Times. A bunch of New York elitists. I'm not reading that. I said, okay. If you lean a little more to the right, how about the Wall Street Journal? He said, capitalists. I said, okay, so what you're saying is, no one is good enough for you, and what you really want me to do is to validate the decisions you've already made about stuff you already read that makes you happy. Because you're angry and you like that stuff, and it feeds your Jones, it feeds your anger habit, and you don't want to step outside of that. And he didn't want to hear that.
I actually have a two-parter. Because even though obviously everybody is all hyped up about Trump, and I'm so sick of every day hearing about Trump, and I understand your frustration with the Republicans, I feel just as frustrated with the Democrats, because basically all that I'm hearing from the left, and I consider myself to be a classical liberal, it's like everything's devolved into evil white men, old evil white men, straight people, and it's turned into this identity politics. And anybody who wants to have an educated discussion, people who are being referred to as the intellectual dark web, who I actually find to have interesting conversation, to make points that are not being brought up on our far right and far left media. And all of this spilling into, basically because colleges now and universities are mostly left run. and again, I'm a liberal, but it concerns me, well, it concerns me, what solution can we have, being that universities are mostly left-run, and this is what's educating kids that are getting out with these identity politics views?
I think you're spending too much time on the so-called intellectual dark web, for one thing. And I think that's a place where people go because they want to have an unmoderated discussion of ideas that otherwise wouldn't stand up to the test of empirical and logical analysis. And that's part of the problem. And you argue that you're coming at this as a classical liberal. I think of myself, you know, for talking about John Locke or Adam Smith, then I'm right there with you. But I think that this notion, as I just said, starting from this assumption, well, all the universities, you know, they identify everybody as evil. All the universities are left-leaning. You know, some of that's true. I've written about this. I wrote a piece 3 years ago saying, look, the emphasis on political correctness is fueling Donald Trump's movement. And I wrote it in the Daily Beast because I wanted to reach liberals, not conservatives. I didn't write it in National Review. We already knew that. I was writing to liberals saying, stop doing this because you're giving oxygen to a guy who loves political correctness because it gives him a straw man to fight with. But this notion that, well, you know, we're all smarter than the public discourse and we're going to go to this one corner of the web, I think is hugely destructive because it feeds that narcissism that says we are the real knowers. We are the people who are really balanced. We are the people who really have real discussions and everybody else is an idiot. The fact of the matter is you live in a country of 330 million people. You're going to have to understand these people on the right and the left. You don't have to agree with them. I don't. I mean, you can tell I get pretty feisty when, you know, when I am, you know, part Irish. But this notion that, you know, dismissing all the campuses because they're run by lefties, that's simply just wrong. Yes, most professors are liberals. But you know, and if you're in a gender studies program, you're probably gonna, you know, your stereotype will be truer, for example. There's not a lot of conservative gender studies programs. But I think, you know, most universities, I still think America's universities are the best in the world. That's why everybody's coming here to get into them. That's why we're being clogged with applications for them from around the world, because they're still the best. What they need to do a better job of is not on the right or the left. It's about being adults versus children. Maybe that's the distinction I'd make, is we have to stop telling the children that they're running the institution and to force them to engage in critical thinking even when they don't like it, instead of asking them what they would like to do, what they enjoy, what makes them happy. College, I say in the book, it's in the chapter on education, college, I had a great time at college, by the way. Again, not sour grapes. I went to Boston University. I had a terrific time. But it also should be a really uncomfortable time. It should make you question things. It should force you out of your bubble, whether it's if you're from a small town or the big city. It should force you to go to school with people who disagree with you and force you to have to think through how to defend those ideas. And to simply wave it away and say, well, you know, universities are all full of lefties. You know, they're not. First of all, physics is not, there's no such thing as left-wing physics. There's a lot of other things going on. You know, there are some. I took a course with when I went to Boston University. I took a course with Howard Zinn. I got an A- for whatever that's worth. And you know what? It was interesting. But you know, I knew what I was getting with Howard Zinn. I also got a first-rate education in a lot of other things. I learned to speak Russian. I learned how to do qualitative analysis. I learned the literature in the field of political science. I learned who Samuel Huntington was and who Karl Deutsch was and you know, who all of these literary giants of my field were. I got things. It can happen. And to simply retreat into the world of the web and to say, I have found a society of knowers, I think replicates the problem. If you want to really engage your fellow citizens, there is only one way to do it, and that is to engage your fellow citizens, whether you like it or not.